My husband Peter and I had only been married for a few short years when we entered into an extended, painful period in our lives. It began with the diagnosis of Peter's dad with pancreatic cancer. He was only 56 and he was given mere months to live. And at the time of his diagnosis, he did not know Christ. While we watched Peter's dad's health rapidly decline, Peter and I decided that, of course, this was the perfect time to try to start a family, with no success. Month after month of bitter disappointment, and I did not handle it well. I was furious with God, but because he was not a particularly tangible target, I also took out my anger on Peter and anyone else who dared get close enough. I sank into a dark depression that lasted for almost 3 years. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that the grief of infertility was also triggering old, unhealed pain that was flooding back into the forefront. Old fears, old doubts, old identity questions, old sadness, old loneliness, and so on. And it was sending me back into old, unhelpful patterns of thinking. It was reinforcing old lies that I had long believed, and I was following old patterns of holding on to emotion, of feeding it and milking it and letting it control my life. Peter and I were a part of a small church plant team at the time, a team which included several young couples, a few of whom became pregnant during this time. And when I withdrew from the church and from women's events for a period of time, the church responded by meeting with Peter to discuss the possibility of invoking church discipline with me, increasing my pain and isolation rather than in any way helping me heal. Not long after this, my mom was diagnosed with cancer and passed away 3 years later. My dad suffered a debilitating fall and passed away just 18 months after my mom. Peter and I experienced multiple miscarriages and disrupted adoption in our journey toward parenthood. In the years since then, God has done a great healing work in my heart and my life. This began with an extended season in which I knew I had to get back to the Gospels and I had to reconnect with Jesus and rediscover the way that he loves and the way that he only can heal. God also used his church in this process of healing for me, and he has grown in me a passion to help other women toward the same healing. So who among us needs healing? The simple answer is we all do. Jesus' healing power is not just for a few particularly wounded women who have experienced excruciating or extreme trauma. We all experience pain in this fallen world. Not one of us is exempt. We all have a very real enemy who wants nothing more than to render us defeated and discouraged and damaged. We all encounter painful incidents in the present, but we also all experience triggering of our past, that process whereby certain events in the now poke old unhealed pain, and we respond to that present situation, sometimes without even being aware of it, with all of the emotion of the old hurt, because it was never properly healed. Dr. Carl Lehman puts these sorts of experiences into the category of trauma. Psychological trauma, Lehman writes, comes from a failure to successfully complete the journey through an appropriate pain processing pathway. This appropriate pain processing pathway happens only when connection is maintained to other people during a painful experience, and only when proper meaning is assigned to the experience, and then wisdom is gained. That is the healthy way through a painful experience and out the other side. However, Lehman writes that if you are a child without anyone in your community to guide you through. Even a fairly minor painful experience can result in psychological trauma because it gets pushed underground. It gets stuffed, and we hold on to it, and it festers, and it feeds lies. And that unresolved toxic content carried in our memory from these experiences goes underground. It's stored in the brain and in our body, and it causes us trouble for years. This trouble comes in the form of triggering. And so that old pain continues to plague us and cause us problems in our present. Our relationships get stuck in the same destructive patterns. We respond to conflict and stress in the same unproductive ways. The people in our lives keep tripping the same triggers and poking the same wounds. And we battle the same wrong thinking. We believe the same bad lies. We repeat the same emotional roller coasters. We hide behind the same thick walls. And this, of course, is not the fullness of life that Jesus longs to give us. He desires to heal and to make us whole. So how then does he do that? In the book of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, we see a beautiful example of the healing work of Jesus when a woman who has been bleeding for 12 long years creeps through the crowd and touches the hem of his garment and is healed. And I believe we can see 7 important truths here about the healing work of Jesus and what that healing would look like for all of us. First of all, this healing that Jesus has requires humility. Another word we might use is vulnerability. This woman's story happens in the middle of the story of Jairus, who comes to Jesus seeking healing for his daughter. And both Jairus and the woman with the hemorrhage have to humble themselves. They have to make themselves vulnerable. They must accept and express their need and come to Jesus for help. To understand the place and the importance of human vulnerability, we can simply go back to Genesis chapter 2. God created man and woman and placed them in the garden naked. It doesn't get much more vulnerable than that. That was his ideal. He created us to be perfectly vulnerable with one another and with him. And initially, Adam and Eve, they knew no shame. Of course, sin changed all of that when it entered the world in Genesis chapter 3 and brought with it shame. Sin and shame wrecked vulnerability. And to this day, we respond to the presence of sin and shame in the same ways that Adam and Eve did. We hide, we cover up with fig leaves, and we build thick walls to hide behind. We hurl blame at one another and even at God. It was the woman you gave me. And we tell half-truths, lies. I was afraid because I was naked and so I hid. And we believe the lies whispered to us by the enemy. All of these responses keep us from the healing that Jesus has. And so the first step toward healing has to be to humble ourselves, to make ourselves vulnerable, to come out from our bunker and to put down our weapons and to make our needs known to safe people, but mostly to God. A second but related truth is this: healing requires courage. It requires a facing into fear. After she has crept through the crowd and touched Jesus' cloak, immediately the woman is healed, and she feels in her body that this is so. But then she tries to slink away unnoticed. Jesus, though, knows that power has gone out of him, and he asks the crowd, "Who touched me?" The disciples are understandably incredulous. What a ridiculous question. Lots of people are touching you, they say. But the touch of this woman was different. And Jesus is persistent in his pursuit of her. He keeps looking around for her. And seeing that she has been found out, she falls at his feet And the passage tells us she is trembling in fear. But she doesn't run. At any rate, she faces into her fear. She stays. She prostrates herself before him. And healing requires us to do the same. Third, this healing that Jesus has is holistic. Jesus isn't only interested in healing this woman physically. If that was all he was up to, he could have let her slink away through the crowd with her healed body. But Jesus is interested in doing so much more. He wants to heal the whole human being. We will see this as we work through the next several points. But Jesus, he wants to address her emotional wounds. He wants to bring her comfort and peace. He wants to heal her mentally. He wants to change her thinking and redefine her identity. He wants to heal her socially. He wants to reconcile her standing in society. And most importantly, he wants to heal her spiritually. He wants to affirm her faith in him. This healing is holistic. Fourth, the healing that Jesus wants to give her involves giving her a voice. When she has fallen on her face before him and she is trembling in fear, what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, "Here she is, I found her. This is her." He doesn't take the microphone and announce his miracle. "Look what I've done." No, he asks a very simple question. He asks her to speak. He doesn't explain what has happened. He simply asks her to speak. Mark 5:33 tells us what happens next. Trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. Luke 8:47 records the same precious moment like this. It says, "In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed." In the presence of all the people, these people who had not long ago shunned her, she speaks up and she tells the truth. She tells her story, a new story of healing and an encounter with the Son of God. I know that a huge part of my own healing journey has been the writing of it and the speaking of it and the sharing what Jesus has done. And I've spoken to so many other women who would say the same. Telling the story of what he has done solidifies our new narrative. Number 5, this healing involves a new identity. After she has told her story, Jesus calls this woman daughter. This might have been partly for Jairus' benefit. This story of the woman interrupts Jairus' story. Jairus was seeking healing for his daughter, and Jesus says of this woman to all the people, "This woman, she is mine." And this title of daughter implies a very intimate, provisional, accepting, loving relationship, an ongoing commitment to care. She is shifted from the category of outcast and destitute to a new category of family and beloved with one simple direct address. He gives her a new identity. Much of our pain throughout our life comes in the form of the labels that we acquire, the labels that we believe define us. The label of infertile was a painful one for me to come to terms with. But Jesus gives us his label, daughter. 6th, this healing requires faith. After Jesus calls the woman daughter, he affirms her faith. "Your faith has healed you," he says to her. When Jesus attributes this woman's healing to her faith, he is not suggesting that she in some way possesses the power needed to bring about the healing herself. No. Rather, that Jesus inspired her faith when she heard about him, and then she believed in his power and she acted on it. That's her faith. Her faith moves. It steps out. Faith is bold. It takes action. but it is the object of the faith that is key. Our faith ought not to be aimed at the action itself or the outcome that we desire, but at the person of Jesus, Son of God. And lastly, the healing that Jesus brings results in freedom and peace. Go in peace, Jesus tells the woman as he sends her on her way. It's more than just a simple salutation. It's a bestowing of shalom, a declaration of wholeness and well-being and prosperity and security that comes only with God's presence and covenant commitment. And it is more than an emotion. Though the feeling of peace may come and go, the condition remains. We have that wholeness and well-being and security, whether we feel it or whether we don't. And then finally, Jesus tells the woman, be free from your suffering. And with those final words, Jesus seals the restoration that he has already completed. And she hears from his own lips what she has already sensed in her body. And she is healed.